Millions of Irish had fled to a better life in America. Many had prospered there, and their families donated thousands of dollars to the rebel cause. But weapons were harder to come by.
There were deep disagreements about how to find arms and to what degree the Irish Republican movement should align itself with the enemies of Britain. This led, of course, to the celebrated case of Roger Casement.
Roger Casement was a British knight who had defected to the rebel cause. Casement turned to the one country he could count on to support a revolt against the British, England's arch enemy in the war, Germany. Casement secretly negotiated with the Germans for a shipment of 20,000 weapons and artillery to aid the Irish rebels. The arms were set to arrive on Ireland's west coast before Easter. But just days before the planned revolt, as Roger Casement was on his way back to Ireland aboard a German submarine, British military authorities broke into German lines of communication and discovered the weapons plot. The British arrested Casement after he landed on Irish shores. No German arms would ever reach the rebels. The British were quickly catching on to the rebel plan. Their wiretaps also revealed that the first target would be the Dublin General Post Office.
British intelligence had parts of the thing understood, but the timing and everything they didn't understand. And really, in many ways, the plan was so bizarre that, you know, if you're a British general, you're sitting there going, well, let's see, they're going to take over a post office. Okay. You know, of all the buildings of downtown Dublin, the post office, why not attack the military barracks?
Back at rebel headquarters, news of Casement's capture, the nearing deadline, and the shortage of guns threw the rebel plan into chaos. And it would get worse. The day before the planned attack, amidst mounting confusion, rumors emerged that the rising was called off.
The rebels decided, well, we're not going to allow it to be canceled, we're going to hold it after all, but they didn't have the communication means to notify the entire country.
With rumors swirling, troops in the Irish countryside believed the rising was canceled. But undeterred, Pearse called his Dublin men to arms. In spite of everything, with only a fraction of their rebel army, they vowed to proceed, just one day behind schedule.
What amongst these individuals creates this sense of urgency? I think that when you've committed yourself to an action in which you're contemplating not only killing people, but dying, that you gotta go. Remember, the purpose of the action is to lead to the ultimate overthrow of Great Britain. Once they've made that commitment, there's like a way that they can't turn back.
At noon on Monday, April 24th, 1916, while most Dubliners were enjoying the annual Ferryhouse horse race, Patrick Pearse and just 1,500 men, carrying crude and outdated arms, set out to end Britain's rule over Ireland.
So they went ahead and had their rising on the Monday in the full expectation that they would catch the British by surprise. They did. They caught themselves by surprise a little bit too, because they very easily captured the General Post Office.
And they run up the tricolored Irish flag, and Pearse steps out of the buildings of the General Post Office with Connolly and Clark and the others behind him and reads a proclamation of the Declaration of the Irish Republic.
We hereby proclaim the Irish Republic as a sovereign, independent state, and we pledge our lives and the lives of our comrades in arms to the cause of its freedom, of its welfare, and of its exaltation among the nations.
Pearse's troops spread out to Dublin's other main buildings. They were getting their rebel footing, but were still an unlikely crew. One of the rebels, leading his men to their post, hijacked a local tram. He collected fares from all 54 of his troops and paid the conductor with a thank you and exact change. Meanwhile, the public was trying to figure out what was going on. So were the British. Thinking the rising was called off, many British officers were at the horse race when they heard explosive gunfire. They scrambled to respond. Countess Markievicz, the aristocrat, was stationed at St. Stephen's Green, a Dublin park. Hearing about trench warfare from the front lines of World War I, she and her men dug trenches, a plan whose flaw was quickly learned when British snipers from neighboring buildings rained bullets on the rebel troops.
Military historians can find plenty of examples of ineptitude and of poor planning on both the British and the rebel side during Easter week. What's fairly clear is that however disorganized both sides were at the very beginning of the conflict, by the end of the week, by Thursday and Friday, British military superiority and determination were overwhelming.
British gunships responded in force. From the banks of Dublin's River Liffey, they targeted the city center, bombing rebel positions, occupied buildings, and taking out civilians and power lines in their wake. Dublin was under siege.
Gunboats came up the Liffey and relatively indiscriminately bombed the locations of rebel control. As a consequence, some of the worst pictures of urban destruction in the center of a European capital came from Dublin in 1916.
They were probably outnumbered 8-10 to 1. They were hoping for the best, but they were prepared to die. They absolutely were prepared to die.
By Saturday, the rebels were overpowered.
Pierce actually observes a civilian getting killed. And it dawns on him that, it's not worth doing anymore. And they weren't going anywhere. They were trapped.
Just 5 days after they began, Pierce ordered his men to surrender.
By that point, many of the leading figures had been wounded, but also lines of communication had been broken. They were largely surrounded, outgunned, and what Pierce was principally interested in doing at the end of Easter week was in trying to preserve some formal dignity to the events that had happened. His surrender was orchestrated to give dignity to his military army.
When authorities seized Pierce's gun, they found it had not been fired since the rising began.
He spent most of the rising in the General Post Office telling ancient Irish tales and Irish history to the men. I'm sure it was a deep inspiration to them, but it's a very odd activity. We have his gun, and we know it was never fired during the event. He was willing to do the blood sacrifice, but he wasn't willing to kill people, apparently, himself.
For all their talk of fighting and dying for Ireland, Pierce and his men had somehow survived, while the bodies of the wounded and dead lay around them. Thousands were injured. 450 were dead. Dublin was destroyed. The air was polluted with the smell of burning buildings and horses killed in the action. One thing the Irish people and the English could finally agree on was their hatred for the rebels.
Many of the people of Dublin viewed the Rising itself as a disastrous, irresponsible form of military adventurism, and as a consequence, for a while it seemed as in fact that the Rising had done a great deal of harm to the nationalist cause.
The rebels were marched through the streets on their way to Kilmainham jail. Dubliners turned out to protest against them, throwing rotten fruit, spitting at them, and kicking them, while Irish women served tea and cakes to the British troops. An editorial in the Irish Times newspaper called for swift and severe punishment. That's what the rebels would get, and it would change everything. The British began by executing the rebel leaders.